27 to 38. Please feel free to read along in your pew Bibles on page 84 in the New Testament portion. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question. "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless, then the second, and the third married her. And so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her." Jesus said to them, "Those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive." May the Spirit of wisdom guide our understanding of this scripture.
Thanks be to God.
I grew up, we did, in southern Maryland, not too far from the waters of the Patuxent River. And during those years, our family, we always had a boat in the carport. And we would take the boat out 5 or 6 times each summer. We'd put the boat, it's on a trailer. We'd trailer it down to Benedict, Maryland, in St. Mary's County, down to the marina there. We'd all get out of the car so that Dad could back the boat up and down the ramp. He'd ease the boat into the water, and we'd all climb in with our life vests and coolers and maybe water skis or occasionally fishing tackle. Dad would go park the car, come back to the boat, get it in the boat, prime the gas pump, turn the key on the boat, and hopefully start the big Johnson engine that was hanging off the back of the boat. And then we would putter out of the cove, keeping our speed down until we were out in the channel, and then Dad would hit the throttle. The front of the boat would raise up like an angry horse until we would plane out, and off we'd go, skimming through the waters of the Patuxent River in our boat, our motorboat, our boat with a big motor on the back end. Our boat that would finally get up onto that plane and zip around the water, taking us to our destinations of fun. That was what our family meant when we said, we're going boating. Which is to say that, even though we grew up around the water, I never had to navigate the waves with anything other than a motor. Or when the motor broke down, a couple of puny little paddles. Which is to say that even though we grew up next to the water, it wasn't until that I was in college that I had my first encounter with a wind-powered boat. A boat that used things called sails, which I have it on good authority were around before big, heavy outboard engines. But I just never had the opportunity to figure out how to work one. Until one afternoon, out on that bay that's between Rehoboth Beach and Lewis, Delaware, my college girlfriend and I each rented a little sunfish sailboat. She was an experienced sailor, and I was not. So there was that thing. Her dad was there too, who was also an experienced sailor who had taught her. So he taught me the basics, so she didn't have to. So that was a good thing. And then I tried my hand at sailing, which for those of you who may not know is boating without a big engine on the back of the boat. There was a lot I had to learn. I had to learn everything, actually. I had to learn how to tack, how to turn about in order to make progress against the wind when you didn't have a motor on the back. I learned that I occasionally had to get up from my snack eating and change sides of the boat that I was sitting on. And as a lifelong motorboater on that day out on the bay, so filled with mistakes and humble pie, I had my first experience with something called a keel. That downward fin that gives a sailboat, especially a small sailboat, its stability out on the water. In that first experience of trying to keep up with my girlfriend, who was sailing around the lake like she was competing in the America's Cup, hi, how's it going? I gained an appreciation for the keel that kept it on afloat. And even though I never really got the hang of how to work a sailboat, I did come to appreciate the keel. The keel of the boat struck me then, and it still strikes me, as a great metaphor for that thing that isn't always seen, but that guides and stabilizes in a way the journey that we are on. The keel that helps steer the boat without drawing attention to itself. The keel that offers stability in otherwise choppy waters. The keel that should probably be remembered more often than it is. Leonard Cohen reminds us that Jesus was a sailor when he walked upon the water, and we know that Jesus was very comfortable with his sailor and fishing friends. I imagine Jesus knew what a keel was. But in this conversation that Kathy read for us today, Jesus, he isn't with sailors, he isn't with his disciples. This conversation is Jesus with a group of people called Sadducees. The Sadducees. Sadducees were an interesting group of folks. If the Sadducees were constitutional scholars, they would call themselves originalists. If the Sadducees were baseball fans, they would still rue the day that the designated hitter came to be a part of the game. The Sadducees, they were purists when it came to the law. What was written in the Torah means precisely what it means, period, that's it. The Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible as authoritative: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They didn't have much use for the prophets and the history, and especially the poetry, which was so open to all kinds of interpretation. For the Sadducees, it was all about what Moses had written down. They were sticklers by the books. And because they were sticklers, they had no use for this one doctrine of faith that had more recently evolved, much more recently than the book of Moses, which is the resurrection. Resurrection, life beyond the grave. 200 or 300 years before Jesus, this started to be a thing. Now, like many Jews, the Sadducees did not have much use for the idea that after death our bodies are resurrected. So here in the Gospel of Luke, we have Sadducees talking to Jesus, kind of trying to convince him that the resurrection is not a thing. And they do this by posing to him a riddle. Jesus, they say, the book of Moses says that if a man dies before he and his wife have any children, the eldest brother of that man is bound by the laws of Moses to marry the childless widow. That's right there in the book. So, the two of them get married, and then if that brother happens to die before the couple has children, then the marriage responsibility falls to who? To the next brother. And then next, and the next, and the next, until in this riddle, 7 brothers have died. This is all written in the book of Moses. Finally, the Sadducees suggest, suppose the woman dies childless, having buried 7 husbands. Now, if you stop the conversation right there, you can imagine a variety of questions someone might ask if this had actually happened. A woman that is childless after burying 7 husbands. Question about the families of the men. Question about the women whose grief extended to 7 husbands and to the barrenness that she felt. You might ask about why these archaic laws were in place at all. You might ask a number of questions, but the Sadducees were trying to prove a point about how awkward it is to believe in a bodily resurrection. So the question was this: in the resurrection, whose wife would the woman be? I think it's safe to say that the Sadducees are testing this notion of the resurrection and how it squares with the laws of Moses. So Jesus responds, and he turns the question around, as he so often does. He says that marriage is something devised by the living, people of this age. And then goes on to say that the resurrection, whatever it is we hope for, is more than we can possibly imagine, and is certainly beyond any of the arrangements we might set up here in this age to keep things neat and in order and ensure that the culture prospers. Jesus essentially says to the Sadducees, I don't accept the premise of your question that the resurrected life somehow mirrors this life. And then Jesus goes on to say, God is the God of the living. Or maybe in this instance, Jesus might have been saying to the Sadducees, let's not worry about whose wife this poor woman would be in the resurrection. Instead, let's think about what it might be like for a woman to bury 7 husbands without the support and companionship of any children along the way. I think Jesus is saying, let's worry about how we treat each other in this life and leave the resurrected life to God. And the cool thing about this encounter, the thing you might not expect, but that so well typifies Jewish culture, the thing that doesn't happen much in our encounters, is that the Sadducees, after this riddle, they say, you know what, you've spoken well. And then Luke says the Sadducees go away. So that's the story of this encounter between Jesus and the Sadducees. And you might fairly ask, what in the world does this have to do with the keel of a sailboat? So here's what I was thinking. A couple of months ago, we had a survey about preaching and what topics might be of interest, and then several of us said, what would be really interesting is to deal with some of the more troubling, difficult passages in the Bible, which I think is a thing for all of us. We may find ourselves as people who identify as Christians, people who follow Jesus, we may find ourselves wondering about the more difficult stuff that's in here. We may love the beautiful worship services and the music, but we might also wonder about the 3,000-year-old social rules we read in that Bible and what they have to say to us. We might find hosting immigrants who are walking to save their status a very noble and important thing to do, but we may also wonder about those war stories in the Bible where God's people, heroes like Joshua and David, take way more life than their fair share. We may want to raise our children in the church and have them learn the stories of Jesus, but still wonder about how women are viewed in most of our scripture. About how Paul is on record as saying, women, be quiet in church. Wives, be subject to your husbands. We wonder about all these things that are in this book. It's supposed to be our book. We might even feel a little at sea when it comes to the Bible and the more difficult stuff. And certainly one way of making sense of the Scriptures, one way of reading this Bible, is the way the Sadducees read it. Like a rule book, like an owner's manual for how to live. If something goes wrong, you consult the Bible. And then try to come to terms with some of its more difficult passages. But another way to navigate the Bible, I think, is to stick a keel in it. To drop something down deep enough into the waters of Scripture that provides some balance and then maybe even some direction. One way to make some sense out of the Scriptures that are difficult is to have a guiding principle that governs everything else. A keel that gives balance and direction. For some of us, that keel might be the life and witness and words death and resurrection of Jesus. That could be the most important thing, the keel. If there's something elsewhere in the Bible that runs contrary to your view of who Jesus was, maybe it should be taken with a grain of salt. Not that it's not interesting or instructive when heard in its context, but it might not be part of its essence, of who we are and what we believe. The life and example of Jesus is a good keel. What would Jesus do is a question that might be important for those who steady ourselves that way. Another keel I know many of us use is the Bible's version of the Golden Rule, as it's expressed in the book of Deuteronomy, and in the Gospels, and by most of the major religious traditions. Love the one you call God, love your neighbor as yourself, let everything fall out of that. It's a very good keel. Micah 6. What does the Lord require of me but to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly? That is a great keel to keep us steady and to give us direction. Judge everything else in the tradition by that one. And of course, there are many others. There are dozens. One of the joys of Bible study is that it gives us a chance to find some of those hidden keels that can make sense out of the sea. So here's my advice for all of us who find ourselves navigating the tricky waters of this Bible. Here's a suggestion about finding a keel and the way we can view parts of the Bible in light of that keel. I learned that day out on the bay between Rehoboth Beach and Lewis, Delaware, that even a good keel does not always keep one from capsizing and having to be rescued by one's college girlfriend. But it does give us an opportunity to transform this book from something that can be confusing and frightening and chaotic into maybe, I don't know, something of an adventure if we give it a try and give it a keel.